and it comes up, this is the, I can't remember, subclavian. Why is everybody okay, this is the thyrocervical trunk that comes off the subclavian, and then it turns into the transverse cervical and the supraspinous. Then also on the subclavian is the dorsal scapular. So if you look over here, the supraspinous, the vasculature goes to the supraspinatus and infraspinatus, and the dorsal scapular goes to the rhomboids and the levator scapula, which is helpful because the nerves are called the same thing and they innervate the same thing. So, okay, right here is the first rib, and that's the start of the axillary artery. So the first thing that comes off in the first portion of the axillary artery is the superior thoracic, and it innervates the first two intercostal spaces. Okay, the second thing that comes off is the thoracoacromial, and it splits into 4 branches: the pectoral, the deltoid, the acromial, and the clavicular. The pectoral goes to the pectoralis major and minor, and the deltoid goes to the deltoid, obviously. Okay, so then the third part, no, this is still the second part. Second part of the second part is the lateral thoracic, which comes down and innervates the superior, or serratus anterior, and the pectoralis major and minor. So basically everything in the front. That's how I remember that. Okay, so then we're now to the third part. And the first thing that comes off is the subscapular. Okay, and it innervates the subscapularis, obviously, that's easy. And then it breaks off into the circumflex scapular, which innervates the teres major and minor and the infraspinatus. And then the thoracodorsal comes down, and it innervates the latissimus dorsi. Okay, so then we have the next branch is the anterior humeral circumflex, which he doesn't have anything in it that innervates, or supplies, I guess. And then you have the posterior humeral circumflex.
Supplies the humeral head. He said that when I was
one. Okay, anterior humeral circumflex, humeral head. Okay, posterior humeral circumflex does the deltoid, and it also sends a little slip, as he calls it, up to anastomosis with the deltoid. And it is the one that goes through the quadrangular space. Okay, so there's also anastomosis here. That's what the stars are, as anastomosis, which I say that word wrong, but don't make fun of me. The circumflex scapular comes around in anastomosis with the dorsal scapular and the suprascapular. Okay, so now here's the teres major, and that marks the where the axillary nerve becomes the brachial, or artery, sorry. Axillary artery becomes the brachial artery. So first thing that comes off is the profunda brachii, and that goes through the triangular space, or interval. He says it wrong, but that's okay. And it comes down and becomes the radial collateral and middle collateral. And then the next one that comes off is the superior ulnar collateral and then inferior ulnar collateral. And I'm going to go all the way through these before I go over here. Okay, so here's your elbow, and then this is where it comes off and becomes the radial and the ulnar.
So that's called your cubital fossa.
Cubital fossa. I was like, what? Okay. So the radial, the only thing that comes off is the radial recurrent, which anastomoses with the radial collateral. Then off the ulnar is the anterior ulnar recurrent, which anastomoses with the inferior ulnar collateral. And then the posterior ulnar recurrent, which anastomoses with the superior ulnar collateral. So they're opposites. Okay, here is the common interossei. And it divides into the interosseous recurrent, which anastomoses with the middle collateral, and then the anterior interosseous and posterior interosseous. Okay, so going over here, oh, there is one thing I forgot. In the brachial, muscular branches come off to supply the biceps brachii, coraco, brachialis, and brachialis. And I'm guessing triceps brachii, but his slides didn't have it in there, but it just would make sense. Okay, so if you look at the anterior ulnar recurrent, because of where it is, it makes sense that it would do the pronator's teres. And if you write them like this, anterior ulnar recurrent, posterior ulnar recurrent, anterior interosseous, radial recurrent, radial, posterior interosseous, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 9. So that's helpful. Okay, the posterior ulnar recurrent. It does the, Pulmonaris longus and flexor carpi ulnaris. So that kind of makes sense for where it's at. The anterior interosseous does the pronator quadratus, the flexor pollicis longus, and the flexor digitorum profundus. And if you think about it and go over here, that's everything that's on the anterior deep layer. So if you remember, anterior interosseous gets everything in the anterior deep layer. Okay. So then the radial recurrent gets the brachioradialis, the extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis, and supinator. And the radial by itself gets the flexor carpi radialis, the extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis, and flexor digitorum superficialis. So these two both innervate to the same thing, so that makes it easier to remember. Posterior interosseous, way to remember this is, because there's 9 of them, it's all 6 of the deep layer of the posterior forearm, and then 4, 5, and 6. And if you remember how to remember 4, 5, and 6, it's this one, the extensor digitorum, extensor digiti minimi, and extensor carpi ulnaris. So that's what I have written here. And then the ulnar by itself is the flexor digitorum superficialis, which I remember that because flexor digitorum superficialis covers a big distance, so it gets radial and ulnar.
And what do the numbers mean again? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5?
That's how many it innervates.
Okay.
So if you little them out like this, it's easy to remember. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 9. And if you want to put ulnar up here, you could do 1, 1. So, okay. So now we're moving on to the hand. Okay, the radial comes down, and if you remember, radial is a loser. It comes around through the anatomical snuff box and comes around and becomes a deep palmar branch. That's why it's the loser. Also, it sends off the princeps pollicis and the radialis indices. Okay? So remember that, you'll get all of those. Okay, then it becomes, the deep palmar arch. But it also sends off a superficial palmar branch here. Now the ulnar comes down, and the ulnar becomes primarily the superficial palmar arch, but it also sends off a deep palmar branch here. So it's all one big anastomosis. Okay, now the deep palmar arch, well, I'll start with superficial. The superficial palmar arch sends off arteries to the digits. That's called the common palmar arteries. Okay. So, and I remember that because common is more palmar. Okay, and then the deep palmar arch sends off the palmar metacarpal arteries. And they're farther down. They're in the metacarpal, so they're in the deep arch. Okay, those two come together and bifurcate again into the proper palmar digital arteries. And I remember that because